Well, Christopher, thanks very much for agreeing to talk to Little Atoms today.
It's a pleasure.
Well, the first thing I want to ask you about is, what do you feel about being bracketed as a Enlightenment fundamentalist?
Well, it could be a term of honour, and even though it isn't meant as one.
Indeed.
For example, in the United States where I live, where I'm a supporter of the American Civil Liberties Union, which exists primarily to defend the First Amendment to the Constitution, there is an expression that we use for ourselves, which is First Amendment absolutism.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we think it means exactly what it says and nothing else. And we don't want anyone messing with, or as they say in America, fucking with, the ipsissima verba. Mm-hmm. We think the words themselves are, if you like, sacred. So I know what it's like in that way to think of words that are written by humans as if they should be taken strictly and literally as intended. And if that's what was meant by Enlightenment fundamentalism, I'd be perfectly happy with it. But as it happens also, I'm sensitive enough to language to know when something surreptitious is being imported into an argument where it doesn't belong. And this coinage is designed to subvert and pervert the argument by implying a moral equivalence, or any equivalence, between those who do not believe there can be a strict scriptural foundation for morality or politics or anything else, and the contrary view, so that it's designed as a propaganda term. And the implication would therefore be that one could be an Enlightenment fanatic or an Enlightenment jihadist, or that would be next. I mean, and I can see the way it's going, and I don't like it. So I've done my best. Actually, I haven't yet done my best. But I've written a little to try and head off this, as I say, surreptitious importation.
Do you think more broadly, I mean, on that point, we're facing or are involved in, as we speak, in a world where you're not allowed to say that one idea is better than another idea?
Well, I think everyone who is a skeptic has to have a position of one kind or another on the question of relativism, which is a very tempting position for a skeptic to take, is to say, how could one ever know that any one position was superior to another? Shouldn't one be open-minded about all? These things are very tempting. I would reply to it, and I'm in the long line of people who've argued better than myself about this ever since Socrates, that an open mind is not an empty mind. That we probably do a priori proceed as if somebody who argues for, shall we say, censorship or torture has learned less and has more to be taught than someone who doesn't.
Yeah.
How could one prove that? Well, it would take a long time, more time than we've got. But to be neutral, in other words, to be affectless, is not quite the same as being open-minded. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think, not quite the same as being relativistic. Yes, it is possible. For example, I think that appearances to the contrary, it's just as stupid to be a Quaker as it is to be a supporter of Sati, because in both cases you depend on a supernatural or spiritual or non-rational authority for your opinion. If you'll do it for one thing, as far as I can see, there's nothing to stop you doing it for another. Yeah. But of course I do not believe somebody going to the Friends Meeting House is the same as someone forcing a Hindu widow to jump onto a pile of burning coals. I'm not relativistic about it in that sense, but I'd be capable of, not just for the sake of argument, saying that they have one very important thing in common that they don't have in common with me.
I think something that a lot of people face, and certainly you probably faced yourself, is that of the secular and political world, is that people will say, well, say Marxism or Trotskyism is just as religious as a belief in supernatural, because again, you're dealing in things that can't be proved. Really, you can't prove that Marxism works, or you can't prove that Trotsky was right. I mean, how does that?
Well, people even say that faith in evolution is as much of a religion as which is quite clearly ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absurd, but because evolution is derived entirely from a wrestling with evidence.
Yeah.
And there isn't a single Darwinian who wouldn't change their mind and hasn't said immediately that they would, if it could be shown that there could never be discovered a fossil that showed transitional forms, for example. Or it isn't at all like the belief that the fossils are put in the rock to test our faith, which is as unfalsifiable if you wish. I just want to add something to what I said before, which is that I would myself prefer to argue with a Catholic who said that they believed in the virgin birth and in transubstantiation and consubstantiation, with a Catholic who says, well, I don't really have to believe in all that. Because I do quite like to know who I'm arguing with. And in a sense, I prefer those who are fundamental or fundamentalist, who assert what I believe they assert when they say they are believers, than those who take it a la carte.
Yeah.
So again, there's no necessary disgrace in saying of somebody they believe what they say. Either these holy books are the Word of God or they are not. If they are, a Christian who says, well, they're open to interpretation is in a very iffy position indeed. How is he going to interpret the Word of God? What gives him that right or her? It's a hugely arrogant claim to make. So there's credit in the term fundamentalist, if you like. I was a Marxist for most of my life, and I still think like one. I'm just not a socialist anymore. When I was one, I suppose I thought that in a way there was a unified field theory of a sort. The materialist conception of history left not much unexplained, and certainly encountered no evidence that contradicted itself. Actually, I still believe that. Yeah. I find it to be a defensible position. It surprises. New evidence can come to light that is not in contradiction with same. But it is not to be held as a religion. Indeed, it is originated as a philosophy that says that if there was any truth in religion, there would be no need for socialism in the first place. If there was a just God or a benign God, there'd be no need for politics. Actually, you'd have everything you needed. Thomas Jefferson actually said, I tremble for my country when I think that God is just. And I've written about this. If there's a just God, what's to tremble about? He was talking about slavery. But rhetorically it's a brilliant thing to say. It suggests that a punishment will fall on those who practice this filthy business. But that's nothing compared to this as a just God.
Well, you mentioned
the bliss that would come from that. Well, Marxism proceeds from there's no salvation to be expected in that direction. Humans being what they are, there's no question in my mind that Marxism became at least quasi-religious, complete with all the trimmings: excommunication, rival papacies, heresy hunts, appeals to the one true word, to the canonical text. So there's absolutely no doubt about that. But it would still be possible, was possible, for those of us who call ourselves Trotskyists, say, or supporters of the left opposition more properly, to point out that this was in contradiction with the original foundational claims of Marxism. This was a parody of itself. It could be criticized in its attempt. In other words, how a Christian can say of somebody, another Christian, well, I don't agree with you because you're a fundamentalist. In other words, you really think this book is true. That seems to be incoherent. Either you're a Christian or you are not. And if you are, you have to believe in some sense that there's been a divine revelation that certain words are sacred and unchangeable.
You raised, when you were talking about Thomas Jefferson's interpretation of the idea of a just God, this idea that there's inherent slavery involved. If there is a supreme being, you described it as permanent supervision and surveillance.
Yeah. Celestial North Korea. Yeah. No, I'm very glad there's no evidence for it, because it would be, to me, intolerable if it were true. It would be indecent to have some force that permanently supervised one's every waking and sleeping thought and action from the moment, at least the moment of birth, until well after death. In fact,
forever.
Forever. In other words, you couldn't escape it as you can from North Korea by dying. It would be the most horrible and complete tyranny imaginable. And it is the template for totalitarianism. It's therefore a relief to me to have been able to conclude that there's not a shred of evidence to suggest that there's a particle of truth to it. I say that because I do know people, and you probably know them too, atheist and agnostic, who sometimes say, many of them ex-religious people, that they're either nostalgic for their belief, they wish it was true, they just can't sustain it anymore, or who are sad that they can't bring themselves to believe how nice it would be if this were the case. Alas, it isn't. I simply cannot imagine why anyone would want it to be true, but that's just my opinion.
But then it clearly is attractive to a vast amount of people to be enthralled to some sort of supernatural totalitarian being.
Well,
in the same way that it's obviously been attractive to people to be enthralled to Stalin or.
Most people, most of the time, have no great desire to be free, unless the burdens of unfreedom become absolutely insufferable. That's actually part of the preamble to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Most people, most of the time, would rather have the trouble of putting up with the oppression than the trouble of throwing it off. It has to be quite intense before